I arrived at the farm in early June of 2015, right after the spring term ended. I was an agricultural student, short on money and heavy on requirements, and this unpaid internship checked several boxes at once. The farm sat in western Oregon, far from any town I recognized, reached by a narrow gravel road that cut through timberland and then opened into rolling pasture. The air smelled of wet grass and manure. The place felt older than it looked, worked hard, and left alone too often. During the day, there were other interns. We shared the work: feeding, cleaning pens, fixing fencing, hauling water, trimming brush, recording weights and health notes. The goats were the center of everything. There were a lot of them, more than I had expected. Mixed breeds, most with bells on leather collars. The bells were not decorative. They let you hear movement across the property, which mattered because the pastures bordered thick forest on 3 sides. The owner stayed during the week. He handled sales, deliveries, and inspections. He knew the goats by sight and seemed to track small changes without writing anything down. By Friday afternoon, he always packed his truck and left. No explanation. He did not ask if anyone was comfortable staying. It was assumed that one intern would rotate through weekend duty. That meant staying alone in the small farmhouse, feeding and checking the animals, and keeping records until Monday morning. The first weekend was mine. The house sat uphill from the main pens. It was a plain structure, older wood, narrow porch, single story. At night it felt higher than the land around it exposed. The forest began close to the fence line, dense with fir and alder. Even during the day, the trees held shadow. The goats changed after dark. During daylight, they milled, ate, lay down, pushed against each other, made noise in bursts. At night, they paced. They followed the fence lines, back and forth, in uneven lines. They stopped to stare into the trees. Their eyes caught the light from my headlamp and reflected back flat and bright. They did not bleat much. Mostly they moved and watched. I told myself it was normal. New place, night sounds, predators in the area. I did my counts every evening. I always did counts. It was part habit, part comfort. I counted bodies and match tags. The numbers never changed. No missing animals. No broken fence. The bells started the first night after the owner left. I heard them from inside the house, faint at first, then closer. It sounded like goats moving along the outer fence, bells knocking in slow rhythm. I grabbed my jacket and light and went outside. The pens were full. Every goat was inside. I counted them again, slower. Same number. The bells continued beyond the fence, moving along the tree line. I walked the perimeter with the light raised. I saw nothing beyond brush and trunks. The bells faded deeper into the woods and stopped. I slept poorly. The second night, it happened again later. I checked the time because I was awake already. The bells move in a wide arc, not fast, not frantic. They sounded deliberate. I stayed on the porch and listened. I did not see movement. I did not open the gate. I checked the goats at first light. They were restless, eyes wide, hooves worn down near the fence where they had paced. I counted them. Same number. No loose collars. No extra bells. Over the next week I stayed on for another weekend. The pattern repeated. Bells at night. No missing animals. No fence damage. During the day, I found small signs that something had moved near the pens. Pressed grass. Scuffed dirt. Nothing clear enough to photograph or report. The forest held too many shapes and shadows to trust my eyes. I began to pay closer attention to the ground. Oregon soil keeps marks well when it is damp. I found prints along the outer fence line. Some were clear goat tracks. Others were harder to place. Split hooves, longer than they should have been, with uneven pressure. I told myself it was angle or erosion or overlap from older prints. The third weekend, I stayed alone again. The bells came closer than before. They circled the house, not the pens. I stood inside and listened as they passed under the porch, then moved away toward the trees. I waited until morning. That morning I found a hoof print on the porch boards. It was pressed into a thin layer of dirt tracked up from a yard. The shape was wrong, too long, the split uneven, one side deeper than the other, as if weight had shifted mid-step. It pointed away from the house. I followed the prints until they vanished in a brush. They did not match the goats. I knew the goats' hooves. I trimmed them. I handled them daily. These were larger and carried weight differently. I cleaned the porch. I wrote notes in the logbook without conclusions. I stayed another week. The bells continued. Always at night. Always outside the fence. I stopped going out to look. I kept the house locked. The goats remained inside their pens. The counts never changed. No tags went missing. On the final weekend, the bells did not stop at the tree line. They moved closer to the house and stayed there. I heard movement in the brush. Heavy steps. I did not look out the window. I stayed still until morning. At daylight, I walked the property carefully. I found more prints near the feed shed and along the porch. Clearer this time. The tracks were cloven but stretched, likely from a person wearing altered boots or homemade footwear. The uneven split suggested a limp or damaged sole. The depth showed weight well beyond a goat. It made sense then. Someone had been using goat bells to mask movement, to blend sound into the farm at night. The forest provided cover. The weekends provided privacy. The owner's absence was routine. Intern turnover was expected. I packed my things that afternoon. When the owner returned, I told him I was leaving early. He did not ask why. He did not try to keep me. He recorded my end date and acknowledged it without comment. His reaction confirmed what I already understood. This was not new. Others had noticed something. Others had left. I reported what I had found to the appropriate local office once I was back in town. I described the prints, the bells, the timing. They listened and took notes. I did not return to the farm. Later, after some distance and time, the events lined up cleanly. A person living or moving through the forest had learned the rhythms of the farm. Goat bells were easy to acquire. Wearing them allowed movement without raising alarm. Altered footwear explained the prints. The goats sensed presence and reacted. The owner likely knew and managed risk by limiting exposure and expecting short stays. Nothing supernatural had happened. No animals vanished. No rules were broken that could be proven. It was a person using isolation and routine to stay unseen. I stopped pursuing rural internships after that. I finished my degree elsewhere. When I think about that place now, I remember the sound of bells moving where they should not have been, and the clear knowledge that someone had stood on that porch at night, close enough to leave a mark, and then walked back into the trees. I inherited the farm the same week the ground froze. The lawyer mailed the papers with a thin letter that said my grandfather had kept everything simple. Taxes paid, no debts, land clear. I remember the place as wide and calm, the kind of farm that sat quiet at the edge of town and never changed. I had not been back since I was a kid. Back then, the fences stood straight and the barn smelled like hay and oil. The house light stayed on late. My grandfather always worked. When I drove in, the lane was almost gone. Grass grew up through the gravel. The old maple near the mailbox leaned hard to one side, its lower limbs dead. The fields had collapsed into weeds and saplings. Fence posts sagged. Wire lay loose and rusted in the grass. It felt like a place that had been left in a hurry, then forgotten. The barns stood where they always had, 3 of them in a line. The first 2 were gray and rotting, doors hanging crooked. The third sat farther back, closer to the tree line. That one looked different. The wood was older, but the door was shut tight. A thick padlock hung at chest height. The metal was new. It caught the light and looked wrong on that door, like something added late to an old plan. The house was empty but intact. Furniture covered in sheets. The fridge unplugged. Dust everywhere. No smell of rot. My grandfather had taken care of things until the end. I slept there the first night on the old couch, wearing my coat. The wind moved through the broken eaves. Mice scratched in the walls. During the day, I walked the land. I found spots I remembered, though they felt smaller. The pond had sunk into mud. The orchard was choked. I kept noticing paths in the grass that did not make sense. Lines pressed down where something heavy had moved the same way over and over. They all led toward the back barn. I did not open it at first. I told myself there was no reason. I had paperwork to sort and a house to clean. Still, every time I crossed the yard, I felt pulled that way. Inside the other barns, there was nothing but rot and old equipment. Tractors without wheels. Feed bins chewed open. The smell of animals was gone. No manure, no bedding. The place had not held livestock in years. That night, I woke to sound. It came from the back of the property. Metal scraping, slow and steady. Something dragging against concrete. It stopped, then started again. Not loud, measured. It went on for minutes, then faded. I lay still and listened. The wind picked up. Trees knocked together. I told myself it was loose tin or an animal in the junk. The next morning, I walked to the lock barn. The padlock was cold in my hand. The door frame showed fresh wear, rubbed smooth in places. The ground in front of it was packed hard, darkened. No tracks I could read, just churned earth. I found a key and a coffee can in the kitchen. It was new too. The teeth were sharp. When I unlocked the door, the smell hit me first. Iron, heavy and clean. Not rot, not manure. The inside was lit by narrow windows high up. Dust hung in the air. Tools lay on a long bench along one wall. They were lined up by size. Hooks, saws, chains, a sledge. All of them clean, recently wiped. The floor had been washed, but not well. The concrete held dark stains that would not come out. There was a drain in the center, rusted open. At the far end, a pin took up most of the space. Thick posts set into the floor. Steel gates reinforced with bars. A chain ran from the back wall to the gate. Heavy links polished bright from use. The feed trough was full, grain mixed with scraps. The air held warmth like a body had been there not long ago. I did not see any animal. I did not hear breathing. The barn felt ready, as if waiting. I closed the door and locked it. My hand shook. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the wood, trying to fit what I had seen into memory. My grandfather had raised cattle once. He had a bull years ago, one he kept separate. I remembered being told not to go near that barn. I remembered the way he watched the gates. Back in the house, I searched for records. I found feed receipts that did not match any herd size. I found vet bills from years back, then none. In the bedroom, under a loose floorboard, I found the journal. It was a small book, wrapped in oilcloth. The writing was tight and steady until the last pages. He wrote about maintenance, weather, repairs. Then the notes changed. Short lines, dates without context, mentions of weight, appetite, strength. One entry said keeping it fed mattered more than anything else. Another said never letting it learn the gates was the only rule that counted. The final pages described an incident. A broken fence, a repair done at night, a reminder to add another chain. The last line said it was getting smart and that mistakes would not be forgiven. I slept poorly after that. The sounds returned each night. Metal on concrete, a low thud now and then like something testing its weight. I did not open the barn again. I checked the lock every morning. It held. On the fourth day, I noticed the chain marks near the door were deeper. The ground was torn. The feed trough inside was empty when I checked through a window. I filled it without unlocking the door, pushing grain through a gap. I felt foolish doing it, but the journal sat heavy in my pocket. That night, the scraping grew louder. It went on for hours. I heard a gate slam once. Not hard enough to break, but hard enough to shake the walls. Near dawn, everything went quiet. I woke to the sound of the barn door opening. Not a crash, a slow pull, wood creaking underweight. The lock did not clatter. I knew then the key had not mattered. I did not get up. I lay still and counted breaths until the light changed. When I finally moved, the yard was empty. The back barn door hung open. The chain lay coiled on the floor, snapped at one link. The pen gate was bent outward. Tracks led into the trees. Deep, wide, sure. Not the marks of a deer or a cow. The ground was torn where the fence line used to be. Posts ripped out. Wire dragged aside. Whatever had been kept had learned more than my grandfather believed. I understood then. He had raised a bull that turned mean and strong beyond sense. Too dangerous to sell. Too valuable to destroy. He had kept it fed and locked. Worked it alone. Cleaned the tools himself. He had believed control was enough. He had been wrong. I left that day. I signed the papers to give up the rest of the land. I never returned to close the barn. The farm went back to weeds and silence. Somewhere beyond the trees, something lived that should have been put down years before. I chose not to be there when it tested the world beyond the gates. I took the night milking shift because it paid a little more and because no one else wanted it. Midnight to 5 in the morning, 7 days a week if I said yes. Fewer questions asked if I kept my head down. The farm sat low in a shallow valley, surrounded by frozen fields that caught fog like a bowl. During the day, it looked ordinary. At night, it felt sealed off from the rest of the county. The road in was unlit. The only glow came from the barn windows and the sodium lights over the silos. Snow muffled everything in winter, and in summer the insects did the same job. The routine was simple. Clock in, hose down the parlor, check the lines, bring the first group through. The cows knew the pattern better than I did. They moved without pushing. They chewed slow. Their breathing filled the space with a steady, wet sound that never stopped. The barn was long and narrow, concrete floor worn smooth by decades of hooves. The stalls ran in 2 rows, metal rails cold to the touch. At the far end was the door to the back lot, usually chained, opening to the fence line and the fields beyond. What bothered me from the start was how calm the cows were. Not relaxed, fixed. They stood with their heads angled the same way, eyes not following me as I moved. When I brushed past a flank, the skin barely twitched. Their ears didn't flick. They stared past me toward the far end of the barn, toward the chain door in the dark behind it. It was the same every night. The moment I noticed it, I couldn't stop seeing it. Around 3:30, during the second run, one stall would be empty. Same stall, third from the end on the left. The tag on the rail told me which cow belonged there. She was never there. I would find her later in a different pen, pressed against the corner, legs stiff, breathing fast. Her hide would be slick with saliva that didn't smell like feed or cud. It dried in strings along her neck and shoulders. There were no bite marks, no blood, just that wetness and the way she shook even after I unhooked the lines. I checked the gates. I checked the logs. Nothing showed a transfer at that hour. The cameras in the barn were old and grainy. The angle didn't cover the far end well. The owner didn't work nights and didn't ask questions as long as the number stayed up. I cleaned the stall and reset it. The next night, it happened again. The sounds were small at first. A shift of weight where there shouldn't be one. A breath that didn't match the rhythm of the herd. I told myself it was airflow in the ducting or the heater cycling. The barn had its own smells that layered over each other until they felt solid. Warm milk, manure, disinfectant. Under it all, iron from the pipes. At 3:30, those smells sharpened, like something cold had cut through them. One morning, after a fresh snow, I noticed hoof prints leading out the back. They were deep and erratic, not the neat lines from feeding time. They went straight to the chain door. The chain hung the same way it always did. The prints continued on the other side, as if the door had been open long enough for one animal to pass. Beyond the fence, the snow was crushed flat in a wide oval. Not a trail, a place. The fence wire there sagged a few inches, posts bowed inward. The snow showed the impression of a body that had been there for a while, weight spread low, ground churned and refrozen. I didn't step into it. I stood on the concrete and looked until my eyes hurt. When I went back inside, the cows shifted as one and then went still again. The empty stall waited. From then on, I watched the clock more than the gauges. I noticed details I hadn't before. A low scrape on metal that left a bright line on a rail. Hair caught on a bolt that didn't match the coat of any cow in that row. The saliva on the found cows smelled sharp, not sweet. Their flanks showed bruising that bloomed under the hide by the end of the shift. Pressure marks, not punctures. The farm kept a bull. He was supposed to stay in the south pen, away from the milking barn. He was old and heavy, brought in for breeding seasons, and kept the rest of the time because it was cheaper than selling him. During the day, he stood like a statue. At night, the south pen sat dark. The fence between the pens was older than the barn floor. I checked it after the third week. The lower wire had been bent and rebent so many times it had a soft curve to it. Mud showed where something had leaned and pushed again and again until it learned where the give was. The latch on the gate bore a smear of dried saliva. I started to see him, not clearly, a bulk at the edge of the lights, a shadow that shifted against the snow without sound. Once, during the quiet between runs, I felt a vibration through the concrete that wasn't machinery. It rose and fell, slow and heavy. The cows lifted their heads in unison and stared. The morning I followed the hoof prints again, the crushed place by the fence was bigger. The snow was packed down to ice. There were drag marks leading back toward the barn, shallow at first, then deeper, then gone. Inside, the empty stall was wet, not just with milk. The floor showed a scuff pattern that led toward the center aisle and then vanished where the other tracks crossed it into noise. I didn't change my routine. I worked faster. I kept my back to the wall when I could. The found cow that night was worse than the others. Her breathing rattled. Foam clung to her mouth. Her eyes rolled until the whites showed. When I finished, I hosed the stall and watched the water run red from a scrape I hadn't noticed before. The end came quiet. It was near the end of winter. The owner found a cow dead in the back lot just after dawn. Her organs were intact. Her body was crushed inward, ribs folded like cardboard. There were no cuts. The snow around her was churned and stamped flat. The fence sagged more than it ever had. The south pen gate hung open. The inspection took weeks. The answer was simple and ugly. The bull had learned the schedule. He had learned the weak place in the fence and the chain on the door. He moved at night when the barn was full and the sounds covered him. He took cows one at a time. He pinned them with his weight, held them down until they stopped fighting, left them alive most nights because he was old and slow and didn't finish what he started. The saliva was his. The crushed place in the snow was where he rested between efforts. They shut the farm down 2 years later after costs piled up and insurance walked away. I left before that. I still wake around 3:30 sometimes. I see a long row of stalls and one empty space at the end. I remember how calm the cows were and how they knew where not to look. My name is Ryan. In September of 2018, I was living on my father's farm in rural Alberta. The land had been in his hands for years before I was old enough to understand it. I had grown up around machines, weather, and the long patience that farming requires. I believed I knew every corner of that property. I was wrong. There was one field my father never worked. 30 acres on the south end, bordered by a line of poplars and a shallow drainage ditch that stayed damp even in dry years. The soil there was dark and loose, the kind that should have produced strong wheat. From the house it looked healthy, green in spring, gold in late summer, no weeds choking it out, no visible reason to leave it alone. Yet every season he worked around it, planting up to the edge, turning equipment away as if there was an invisible fence. He never explained it. He did not need to. On a farm, you learn which habits are not worth questioning. That changed one evening late in September. Harvest was behind schedule. A stretch of wet weather had kept us out of the fields, and the forecast showed another system moving in. My father decided to make one pass through the untouched field. He said nothing about why. I climbed into the cab with him, more curious than concerned. The tractor entered the field just before sunset. The wheat stood tall and dry. The air was still. No wind. No birds moving. The sky was pale, washed out from a long day of sun. At 6:52 p.m., dead center of the field, the tractor stalled. There was no warning, no sputter, no smoke. The engine shut off as cleanly as if someone had cut the power. The dash lights went dark. The cab fell silent. Before either of us reached for anything, the ground began to vibrate. It was not shaking. It was a low hum, steady, even, the kind of sound you feel more than hear. I felt it in my teeth and along my jaw. The steering wheel buzzed under my hands. Loose dust on the floor trembled. The wheat around us bent outward in a wide circle, flattening slightly as if pushed from below. The air stayed still. The stalks did not rustle. They moved together, slow and controlled. My chest tightened. My father sat rigid beside me, eyes fixed forward. The vibration lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then it stopped. The wheat eased back upright. The silence returned. We did not restart the tractor. We climbed down and walked back to the yard without looking behind us. The sun dipped below the trees as we crossed the fence line. The field behind us looked normal again. That night, from the farmhouse, we watched the field. The house was old, thick walls, windows that reflected more than they revealed after dark. The field lay beyond the yard lights, a dark mass broken only by the pale line of the drainage ditch. As the sky fully darkened, movement became visible. Shapes moved through the wheat. They stayed low, just below the height of the crop, tall and narrow, but not upright. They moved with purpose, bending the wheat aside as they passed. They did not cross the field edge. They did not approach the buildings. They circled and turned back, keeping to the same paths. No lights, no sound, just motion. My father secured the house. Doors, windows. He shut off every light that faced the field. The interior went dim, lit only by lamps pulled away from glass. We sat and watched until the movement stopped. Sleep did not come easily. The hum stayed in my head long after the field went still. In the days that followed, the tractor refused to run properly. Fuel lines clogged, filters fouled, electrical faults that did not trace cleanly. The repair shop found nothing definitive. We kept the machine out of that field. The wheat in that area never came off clean. Yields were low, grain weights uneven. The soil tested high in nutrients, yet behaved wrong under equipment. Soft in places, resistant in others. Drainage stayed poor no matter how we cut the ditches. I began to notice smells when the ground warmed in the afternoon. Not rot, not manure, something deeper and heavier, like old damp earth mixed with metal. My father did not speak about it. Instead, he brought out records, old land transfer documents, inspection notes, handwritten logs from before he owned the farm. I read them at the kitchen table while he worked outside. Years earlier, before regulations tightened, the previous owner had dealt with a disease outbreak. Livestock that could not be sold or transported. Quarantine conditions. Disposal done quickly, quietly, and on site. Hundreds of animals buried in trenches across that field. No liners. No proper depth. Just soil pushed back over mass graves and seeded over to hide the disturbance. Time had done what time always does. The ground had settled unevenly. Cavities formed as material broke down. Gases built up and moved through the soil. Microbial activity spiked and dropped in cycles. Heavy equipment crossing that ground stressed weak points and collapsed voids. The hum I felt was not alive. It was pressure release through layered soil, amplified by the weight of the tractor and the density of the crop. The shapes we saw at night had explanations too. Deer moving through tall wheat follow paths of least resistance. From a distance, their backs and heads align into long, narrow forms. In low light, depth disappears. Movement flattens into silhouette. The still air carried sound poorly, making everything seem closer and quieter than it was. Nothing about it required anything unreal. It required only neglect, secrecy, and time. Understanding did not make it easier to live with. My father arranged for the field to be taken out of production. Environmental assessment followed. Soil remediation plans were drawn. Fencing went up. The field was seeded to grass and left alone. Heavy equipment stayed clear. Over the next year, the ground settled further. Depressions formed where none had been before. After rain, water pooled in long, narrow shapes that matched the paths we had seen at night. The hum never returned, but the smell lingered on hot days. I moved away not long after. The farm remained in my father's care, but that field stayed untouched. From the road, it still looks healthy. Green in spring, gold in late summer. Only those who know the history understand why nothing ever grows right there. When I think back to that evening at 6:52 p.m., what stays with me is not fear of the unknown. It is the weight of what was hidden and the cost of burying problems instead of facing them. The land remembers, not in anger, not in mystery, just in the slow, physical language of soil, pressure, and time. We rented the farmhouse because it was cheap and far from everything. Lockdown had cut our income, and isolation sounded safe. The listing showed wide fields, an apple orchard wrapping the house on all sides, and a gravel road that ended at the front gate. The owner lived hours away and said the place had been in his family for generations. He gave one rule in the listing notes and repeated it in an email. We could walk anywhere on the property except the old packing shed at the far edge of the orchard. He said it was unsafe, that the floor had rot and the roof sagged. We agreed without thinking about it. The shed looked small in the photos, a dark rectangle behind rows of trees. The house itself was plain and solid. White siding stained by years of rain. A tin roof with dents that caught the light at dusk. Inside smelled of dust and apples that had soaked into the wood over time. The floors creaked in a steady way, the kind that felt earned. We unpacked slowly, opened windows, and let the air move through the rooms. From every window, the orchard pressed close. Trunks lined up in rows that bent with the land. Apples hung heavy, green and red, some already fallen and soft. There were no neighbors, no traffic. At night, the dark arrived all at once. The first few days passed quietly. We worked during the day, cooked simple meals, and walked the rows in the afternoon. The ground was uneven with old irrigation lines and fallen fruit. Bees hovered over splits in the skins. The smell was sweet then clean. The packing shed stayed distant, half hidden by a bend in the rows. Its roof dipped on one side. We didn't go near it. The knocking started after sunset on the fourth night. It wasn't loud at first. A dull thud against the porch steps, then another against the siding. I thought apples were dropping on their own. The sound had weight, though, a sharp impact followed by a roll. Another hit the roof and slid down the metal with a scrape. We went to the window. The orchard stood still. No wind moved the leaves. The air felt thick. A sour smell drifted in, like crushed apples left too long in a bucket. Fermentation. It settled low and heavy and didn't lift until morning. The next night, it happened again. Apples struck the porch, the door, the roof. They came in bursts, then stopped. I stepped outside with a flashlight and found fresh splits in the skins where they had hit. Some lay far from the trees, past where a fall would carry them. I told myself gravity could do strange things. The ground sloped. Fruit could bounce. The smell grew stronger as the light faded, sharp and alcoholic, clinging to the back of my throat. A few days later, I noticed muddy handprints on the side of the house beneath the kitchen window. The mud was dark and wet, pressed flat against the siding. Each print showed long fingers splayed wide. They sat higher than my shoulder. I washed my hands and tried to measure against the marks. My reach barely matched the bottom edge. The spacing suggested someone had leaned in, weight forward. The orchard soil was damp from irrigation, not mud that would stick like that unless it had been worked. I scrubbed the siding until the marks faded. My partner shrugged it off and went back inside. I stayed out longer than I meant to, listening. I began to notice small things. Paths worn between certain trees, not straight rows, but side tracks that curved away from the house. Empty crates stacked behind trunks, their wood gray and splintered. A length of rope tied high in a branch, too high for me to reach without climbing. At dusk, birds lifted from the orchard in waves, as if pushed from below. The smell returned every evening, stronger near the ground, strongest when the air cooled and settled. One afternoon, I searched drawers for a screwdriver and found a bundle of old Polaroids wrapped in a cloth. The edges had curled. The images showed the orchard decades earlier. Workers stood in rows with baskets, some smiling, some stiff. The dates were written in thick pen on the bottom margins. As I flipped through them, a figure appeared again and again at the edge of the trees. Same height, same lean build, shoulders slightly forward. The face was never clear. The person stood apart from the group, half turned away. The dates spanned decades. The clothes changed, but the posture did not. In one photo, the figure wore boots caked with mud. In another, bare forearms streaked dark. Always at the edge, never closer. I set the photos back and washed my hands. The smell seeped in early that night. Apples struck the siding with more force. One hit a window and cracked it, a thin star spreading from the point of impact. I checked the weather. The air outside was still. Leaves hung motionless. The orchard felt awake in a way the house was not. Sleep came in short pieces. The knocks arrived in clusters, then stopped as if someone listened. I heard movement between the trees, a shuffle of steps that paused when I shifted in bed. In the morning, I found apples gathered near the foundation, placed in a line as if rolled there on purpose. Some are bruised deep, the flesh brown and wet. I broke the rule the next day. I followed the worn path that curved away from the house toward the packing shed. The ground changed as I moved, packed hard in places, soft in others. The shed stood larger up close. The roof sagged, but not enough to explain the warning. The door hung crooked. Inside, the floor had been reinforced with newer boards. Crates lined one wall, stacked neatly. A tarp covered a low platform. The air smelled sharp and sweet, strong enough to sting my eyes. I lifted the tarp and found barrels cut down to waist height, filled with crushed apples in different stages. Some bubbled slowly. Others had dried skins floating on top. A sling lay on a nail by the door, thick elastic worn smooth. A bucket held stones sized to fit a hand. Behind the crates, a sleeping area had been built from pallets and blankets. Boots sat by the wall, large soles worn thin. A coil of rope hung from a beam. A mirror leaned against the wall, streaked and cracked. I did not stay long. I did not touch anything. Back at the house, I watched again. The photos made sense now. The figure at the edge had been part of the place. Not a single person, but a role passed on, a family line of workers who never left. Lockdown had emptied roads and fields. The orchard had not been empty. That evening the apples came faster. They hit the windows in quick succession, timed, aimed. One shattered the cracked pane. Glass fell inward onto the floor. The smell poured in. I moved through the house, closed doors, pulled blinds. From the back window, I saw movement between the rows, low and steady. Shapes shifted where the light failed to reach. No wind touched the leaves. We left before dawn. We packed only what fit in the car. As we drove away, apples lay scattered across the yard and road, some split open, some intact. The packing shed stood quiet, door closed, the orchard around it neat and ordered. Weeks later, the owner emailed to ask why we had gone early. He mentioned workers who checked the place when families rented it, people who kept the orchard productive when markets failed. He said the packing shed was off limits for safety. He said nothing else. I took the job because it paid cash and because my cousin said it would be quiet. I had been between apartments for a month, sleeping in my truck with a sleeping bag that never seemed to dry out. The cold snap came early that year. Nights dipped low enough to crack plastic buckets and freeze diesel. A cattle farm outside town needed someone to watch newborn calves overnight, mostly to make sure they did not freeze or get trampled. I had grown up around farms. I knew how to check a heater, how to clear ice from a water line, how to move slow and calm around animals in the dark. It sounded simple. The owner met me at dusk on the first evening. He walked the yard with a flashlight, pointing out the main barn with the maternity pens, the 2 silos, and the generator shed near the fence line. He showed me where the breaker was, where the extra straw was stacked, and where the thermometers hung. He did not mention the smaller calf barn behind the windbreak of dead poplars. I noticed it anyway, set back from the rest, low and long, with a shallow roof and a door that faced away from the house. I assumed it was storage or an old shelter. That first night was clear and still. Snow had crusted over, making every step sound loud. The calves were quiet, bundled under heat lamps that hummed and popped. I made my rounds every hour, writing times on a scrap of cardboard with a dull pencil. At 1:40 a.m., as I crossed the yard to check the generator, I saw a yellow light coming from the smaller barn. It flickered, not steady like the lamps in the main barn. I thought another worker must have come out to check a berth and forgotten to tell me. The owner had said there were others on call. As I walked toward it, the air changed. The cold hit fast, like stepping into shade after sun, but sharper. My breath went white at once, thick clouds that hung instead of drifting. The night itself had not dropped like that. The wind was still. The snow did not creak the same way. The door was half open. Inside, the light came from a single bulb swinging on a cord, stuttering as if the power was weak. The stalls were empty. No calves, no straw, no buckets, no heaters. The concrete floor was dry and pale, cracked from age. Deep hoof prints were pressed into it, darker than the rest, as if the concrete had once been soft and then set around them. They were wrong. Too narrow at the heel, the toes split not like cattle. The spacing was off, the stride longer. I stood there too long, counting the marks, trying to make sense of them. The bulb flickered again and went dark. The cold eased the moment it did, my breath thinning back to normal. I backed out and closed the door. I told myself there was a simple reason. An old barn, wired badly. A draft that pulled cold air. Prints from horses long gone. I finished my shift and slept in the truck with the engine off to save fuel, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. Over the next nights, the lights came on again twice, always after midnight, always yellow and uneven. Each time, the air near that barn felt wrong, colder than it should have been. I stopped going inside. I stood at a distance and watched until the light went out on its own. The calves in the main barn stayed healthy. No births were missed. Nothing seemed out of place there. Midweek, during the day, I went into the office to warm up and grab coffee. Maps were tacked to the wall, laminated sheets showing fence lines, water runs, and buildings. The smaller barn was not on any of them. There was a rectangle drawn where the windbreak stood, labeled Old Shelter, but nothing behind it. I traced the lines with my finger, checking dates in the corner. The maps had been updated the year before. I asked about the building when the owner came in to check feed numbers. He did not answer right away. He looked at me longer than needed, then denied that there was a barn there at all. He said I must have walked past the old foundation and mistaken shadows for walls. He moved on to another topic without waiting. I felt heat in my face and let it drop. I needed the money. The next morning, after a night when the yellow light had stayed on longer than usual, I found blood near the windbreak. It was fresh, dark, and wet against the snow, still warm enough to melt a thin ring around it. There were no tracks leading away, only smears as if something heavy had been dragged a short distance and lifted. I checked every animal. No cuts, no missing calves. The cows were calm, chewing, steam rising from their backs. I followed the blood to the smaller barn. The door was shut. Inside, the floor was clean again. No smell, no stains. The hoof prints were still there, sharp as ever. I noticed then that the concrete had been poured over older marks, layers visible along the wall where the floor met it. The building was newer than it looked. The wiring was newer too, the cord patched with tape, the bulb replaced recently. I started paying closer attention. Trucks came at night when I was supposed to be alone, unmarked, engines idling low. They parked behind the windbreak where the house lights could not reach. I stayed in the main barn, counting breaths, listening to doors thud and metal scrape. The yellow light flickered each time, then went out before dawn. By the end of the week, I understood enough to know I should leave. The farm was not just watching calves. It was moving them. Newborns taken before they were logged, slaughtered quietly, sold off books. The prints were from horses used to move bodies fast without machines, the narrow heels fitting old shoes. The cold came from industrial freezers run hard off the generator, vents hidden to bleed chill into the barn so meat could be handled without spoiling. The blood I stepped in was from a kill done in a hurry, cleaned before daylight. The building was not on the maps because it was never meant to be. It sat just inside the line where inspectors did not walk. The owner denied it because denial was safer than explanation. I had been hired to keep watch, not over calves, but over silence. I finished my last shift and left before dawn, the sky pale and empty. I did not take the cash waiting on the desk. I drove until the truck warmed and the smell of hay faded from my clothes. I did not report it. I did not go back. The job stayed quiet because that was the point. The farm sat low in the land, not on a hill or a rise, but in a shallow bowl where water lingered after rain and never fully dried. It had been there since the 1960s, and it felt like it. The buildings were square and tired. The metal roofs were dull, pitted, and warm to the touch by mid-morning. The air carried a mix of old feed, rust, rot, and bleach that never cleared, no matter how long the wind blew. It clung to my clothes and hair. It settled in my throat. I was asked to stay for a week while my uncle was in the hospital. The work was simple on paper. Feed the pigs twice a day. Check the water lines. Lock the gates at night. Family lived close enough to reach in minutes, but after sunset the place was empty. The nearest house lights cut off early, and the farm went dark except for a single pole light near the main barn that buzzed and flickered. The pens themselves were clean. Too clean. The pigs were healthy and heavy. their skin pale and scarred from years of rubbing against metal. They moved as a mass when I walked by, hundreds of bodies shifting, hooves churning mud into a smooth paste. Inside the pens, the ground was packed hard. Outside them, it was wrong. Every step sank more than it should. The soil gave way like it had been turned recently, but it stretched everywhere beyond the fence, not just in one spot. It felt worked over, loose and damp, even after days without rain. During the day, the farm made constant noise. Grunts, squeals, metal clanging as pigs leaned against the rails. Flies hovered in thick clouds. The sound never stopped. At night, it should have continued, lower but steady, the way livestock always does. It did not. The first night, I woke at 2:06 a.m. without knowing why. The clock on my phone glowed in the dark. The air was still. The fan rattled once and then settled. The pigs were silent, not resting quiet, empty quiet. No shifting, no snorting, nothing. Then the steps started. They came from the far end of the property, near the tree line, and moved along the fence. Each step was heavy and spaced evenly, slow and deliberate. The fence ticked and groaned as pressure met the metal. It sounded like someone walking with purpose, checking each section. The steps reached the corner, paused, then continued down the long side, facing the woods. I stayed in bed and listened until the steps faded. At some point, the pigs began to breathe again. A few low sounds returned, cautious and scattered, like the noise after a storm passes. The second night, the same thing happened. I woke before the sound, already tense, already listening. The pigs cut off at the same minute. The steps followed. The pattern did not change. During the day, nothing looked disturbed. The fence stood straight. The gates were latched. The pigs behaved normally, crowding the troughs, pushing and biting at feed. I told myself it was an animal. A bear, maybe. The woods were thick and old. The farm bordered them on two sides. Bears leaned on fences. Bears walked perimeter lines. Bears dragged things. The third night, I stayed awake. At 2:05 a.m., the pigs stopped. The silence rolled across the pens like a wave. My chest tightened. I stood at the window and watched the darkness. The pole light threw a weak circle that did not reach the fence. The steps came again, closer this time, the ground vibrating faintly through the floor. The fence gave a low, strained sound, not a rattle, but a dull bend under weight. The steps passed beneath the window and continued on. On the fourth night, I took the flashlight and went outside. The air was cool and wet. The smell was stronger at night, heavier, like something buried shallow and breathing through the soil. The pigs stood pressed together, eyes reflecting white in the beam, bodies stiff. None of them made a sound. I followed the fence line. Several sections were pushed inward. Not broken, not bent sharply. Pressed, like something had leaned its full weight against the metal and held it there. The ground beneath those spots was churned and slick, marked with long grooves that led away from the fence and toward the woods. The marks were straight and deep, as if something heavy had been dragged on purpose, not pulled at random. The grooves disappeared into the trees. I did not follow them. The rest of the week passed the same way. The silence, the steps, the pressure on the fence. I slept during the day and stayed awake at night, watching, listening. Nothing ever crossed into the pens. Nothing ever showed itself. The pigs never screamed. They never scattered. They went still and stayed that way until the steps left. When my uncle returned, thinner and moving slow, the farm did not change. The smell was the same. The ground beyond the pens was still soft. The fence still bowed inward in places. I did not ask questions right away. I watched instead. Over the next few days, I learned what had happened without being told directly. I found old records in the office, stacked in boxes that had not been moved in years. Mortality logs, veterinary notes, photos taken for insurance. In the early 1990s, pigs had gone missing. Not one or two, dozens, sometimes more. Fences torn open, blood dragged into the woods. Losses written off, claims denied. Then the notes changed. No more losses, no more breaches. Only entries about noise disturbances, reinforced fencing, and disposal procedures moved off-site. The ground beyond the pens was not burial soil. It was turned because carcasses were dragged across it again and again over years, always along the same routes. The bleach smell was not for cleanliness. It was to cut the scent near the pins and keep it concentrated where it was wanted. The steps were not human. They were too steady, too heavy, too consistent. The fence was pressed inward because something large leaned on it to reach what lay just beyond. The drag marks led to bait piles placed at the edge of the woods, far enough to keep the animals focused there instead of testing the fence itself. The pigs went silent because they sensed it before I did. Livestock knows the difference between random movement and a predator on a path. They froze because freezing kept them alive. Noise had once meant loss. Silence meant survival. The farm had not solved the problem by removing the threat. It had learned how to live with it. The perimeter walks were routine now. The pressure against the fence was expected. The woods took what they were given, and in return, they left the pens alone. When I left, I did not feel relief. I felt a dull understanding settle in. The farm had been running since the 1960s because it adapted, not because it was safe. The silence at 2:06 a.m. was not a mystery. It was a schedule. My name is Mark, and this happened in October of 2009 in southern Illinois during the last stretch of harvest. I was in college and broke. 3 friends and I took a short-term job on a family farm running grain trucks and clearing fields behind the combines. It was legal, cash paid, no paperwork beyond our names on a yellow pad in the farm office. The days started before sunrise and ended when the light drained out of the sky. The nights were quiet in a way I had never known before. We slept in an unused farmhouse at the edge of the property. The place had been closed up for years. The air smelled like dust, old wood, and something faint and sweet that I later realized was dry corn husk. Calendars from the early 1980s still hung on the kitchen wall. The pictures were faded and curled. The dates meant nothing. We slept on cots in the front rooms because the bedrooms upstairs felt heavy, like the air never moved up there. At night, the house popped and settled, and the wind pushed against the siding with a slow pressure that made it feel like something leaning in. The work itself was simple. We drove trucks alongside the combines, hauled grain to the bins, then went back out to clear debris and mark wet spots. The field stretched farther than they looked. Corn stubble cut through gloves and boots. The machines shut down before full dark, but we often stayed out late finishing runs. When the equipment stopped, the land went still all at once. No engines, no radios, no voices. Just wind and insects and the sound of our own movement. The first night, I noticed something was after a long shift. I stepped off the porch to head toward the truck, and I heard movement in the standing corn beyond the harvested rows. It was not the quick darting sound of deer or raccoons. The stalks bent slowly, higher up than any animal I knew. The sound tracked along the edge of the field as I walked. When I stopped, it stopped. When I took another step, it followed. I stood there long enough to feel foolish, then kept moving. I told myself it was wind, even though the air was still. Over the next few nights, it kept happening. Always after dark. Always once the machines were silent. The movement stayed just inside the uncut corn, pacing us across the yard or along the dirt road. It never rushed. It never broke into the open. The height stayed wrong. Corn bent at shoulder level, sometimes higher. We tried to explain it away without saying much about it. Everyone felt it. No one wanted to put a shape to it. The farmhouse windows faced the fields. From the kitchen, you could see the north field clearly. That field had a drainage ditch cutting through it and a line of older trees along the far edge. One evening, as the light faded, the farmer came by to drop off fuel cans and check the bins. His movements were careful and slow, like someone conserving effort. Before he left, he made it clear we were not to use the north field after dark. There was no reason given. He did not look toward the field when he made the point. He locked the gate behind him and drove away. We did not listen. We were tired and behind schedule, and the north field was dry and easy. Around 11:18 p.m., I was driving the grain truck along the cut rows. The headlights lit the stubble in a flat white beam. The radio played low, then crackled once. The engine shut off clean, like the key had been turned. No sputter, no cough, just silence. The truck rolled a few feet and stopped. I tried the key. Nothing. The dash lights were dead. The radio stayed silent. The field around me felt larger without the engine noise. The standing corn to my right leaned inward. I could hear movement again, closer this time. I stayed in the cab longer than I should have, listening. The sound was slow, deliberate, and high. The stalks bent at a steady pace. I got out of the truck and checked under the hood with a flashlight. Nothing obvious. No loose cables. No smell. The battery cables were tight. The fuel line looked fine. The light caught the tops of the corn and the edge of the ditch beyond. I felt watched. The feeling pressed against my back. I moved faster, climbed back into the cab, and waited. After a few minutes, I turned the key again. The engine started like nothing had happened. I drove back to the yard without finishing the run. We did not go back to the north field that night. We stayed inside the farmhouse with the lights off. The movement stayed out in the corn for a long time. It circled the yard once, then drifted away toward the trees. In the morning, we walked back out to the truck. The field looked normal in daylight. Corn stubble, tire tracks, broken husks. Around the driver's side door, the ground was marked with footprints. Bare feet, human-shaped, toes pressed deep into the soil. The prints were long and heavy, like someone carrying weight. They circled the truck once. Then they stopped. No leading away. No trail back toward the ditch. Just an empty patch of ground, and then nothing. We checked the truck again. Under the dash, a small wire had been pulled loose from the ignition switch and pushed back in. It explained the clean shutdown and restart. The radio antenna wire had been twisted hard enough to break the internal connection. It explained the single crackle and silence. Someone had reached into the cab while I was gone. The farmer came later that day. He walked the area, looked at the prints, and checked the ditch line. He spent a long time near the trees. After that, he called the sheriff. We stayed back and watched from the yard. By the end of the afternoon, the explanation came together through actions, not words. The deputies followed the ditch north and found a makeshift shelter tucked into the bank, hidden by weeds and scrap tin. There were old boots, but no socks. Food wrappers, empty water jugs, a coil of wire. The man they took out was tall, thin, and barefoot. He had been living there for weeks, moving through the corn at night to avoid being seen, using the field for cover. He had learned the pace of the workers and mirrored it to stay just out of sight. He bent the stalks high because that was his height. He avoided shoes because bare feet left fewer clear tracks in the stubble. He had climbed onto the truck using the side steps, leaving the prints to end in the middle of the field. The farmer had known there was someone out there. He had seen signs before harvest started and hoped the noise and lights would push the man on. When that did not happen, he tried to limit where we worked at night. We finished the season using only the south and west fields. The night stayed quiet. The corn no longer moved after dark. When we left, the farmhouse went back to being empty, calendars still marking days that had already passed. I still think about how close that man had been, standing just beyond the light, waiting for engines to stop.